Welcome to State of the State, the monthly roundup of policy and research for the state of Michigan, brought to you by the Institute of Public Policy and Social Research at Michigan State University and our friends here at WKAR Studios. I'm Arnold Weinfeld, Associate Director for the Institute. I'm joined by co-hosts, Institute Director Dr. Matt Grossmann and MSU economist Dr. Charley Ballard. Later on, we'll be joined by our guest, Dr. Siddharth Chandra, a professor in the Department of Epidemiology and Biostatistics at MSU. Dr. Chandra is also a professor of economics in James Madison College and director of the Asian Studies Center. We'll be discussing his latest work on pandemic reemergence and comparing the 1918 pandemic with our current situation. But before that, Matt and Charley, always plenty to talk about. There's never a shortage of politics and news on the economy. Charley, the Fed Reserve Chair, was noted this past week as discussing the economy and how we should not get complacent. Then there was other reports about some concerns about inflation. What are you seeing nationally and in the state of Michigan now and maybe over the spring, for instance? We'll just keep it to the spring for now.
Well, go back a year. In April of last year was the worst month by many measures in the history of the U.S. economy. And then I think a lot of economists and businesses and others were surprised at the strength of the rebound in the spring and summer as we adjusted somewhat to the new realities of social distancing, and people found out how to keep at least some businesses going, even though they couldn't do it in the usual way. And there was a surge in demand for other things like home exercise equipment, lots of other things. And so what we've done in terms of the economy since the crash last April, we've made up half of the shortfall in employment, more than half of it in the amount of output, the amount of stuff that we're making in goods and services. But I think that to get all the way back, we've got to have better progress against the virus. And Dr. Chandra is going to talk about that later. I think we'll have a lot to say about that. But right now, if Johnson & Johnson, Moderna, and Pfizer are able to deliver as many doses in the next 5 weeks as they say they're going to, and if the local distribution systems through local county health departments and so on, if they're able to get those shots in people's arms, I think in a few months we will have made very substantial, better progress than we are now. We've already seen a reduction in deaths and hospitalizations and cases, but I think that could go further if we get enough people vaccinated in the next few months. So that's leading some of us, myself included, to think that the rebound of the economy may be faster and sooner and bigger than we previously thought. Only a few months ago, most of us were saying that you won't see much recovery until the first half of 2022. I think there's now a decent chance that we'll get substantial recovery well before the end of 2021. And that has led to some concerns that we might actually overheat the economy. We see some interest rates rising. Chairman Powell is trying to find the narrow sweet spot, correct balance between not doing enough and doing too much. But I'm actually more optimistic about the economy than I was even a few months ago.
And finding that balance involves the federal government and how much money they continue to pump into the economy. Certainly, since the start of the pandemic, various stimulus packages have helped the state of Michigan's budget. Hasn't helped the partisanship, as we saw the other day with the Senate embroiled in controversy on how much of that federal money should be doled out and when. But Matt, what are you seeing in terms of federal budget policy moving forward? There's a large stimulus that's about to be voted upon, I believe.
That's right. The states are still allocating the funds from the December bill that was passed, and we're about to see another $2 trillion of federal spending in the COVID relief package, including $200 billion for state governments directly, and then a lot of money that will run through state governments, including more education funds. As you mentioned, there's a holdup in the governors and legislature negotiating, but it really isn't over whether or how to spend the money. It's really over somewhat unrelated disagreements about the governor's powers on COVID and the legislature's few tools to deal with that. So I expect a lot of money coming in. In total, it should be about a 4 or 5% increase in state budgets across the country, and Michigan will get its roughly fair share of that. And so that could make a big difference. Now, historically, including in the last stimulus, what happened was a rise followed by a cliff. And so one thing we'll be watching is whether that state budget situation is helped only for a couple of years and then has just a bigger cliff to fall off, or whether it'll be smoothed out a little bit more than last time. One concern is that in addition to that direct money to the state government benefits a lot from that other funding from the federal government. Everything from unemployment insurance benefits to increased SNAP or food stamps to child benefits. All of that is going to do things generally for the state economy, and then more directly for state tax revenue. So if that falls off at the same time as the direct funding from the federal government, then we could be in trouble down the line. But for now, things are looking much better for the state budget in addition to for the economy.
The state budget predictions last May were very dire. But I don't blame the people, many of whom I know personally, who made those predictions, because they were going on the best evidence that they had after a horrible April. And it turns out that the rebound of the economy has been better than a lot of us feared, and that has had positive effects for revenues for Michigan for all the reasons that Matt mentioned and others. And that's meant that the state budget situation going through the last 6 months or so has not been nearly as desperate as we thought it might be. And now, if all of this from the new stimulus comes through, the state budget will be, at least for a while, in some of the best shape that we've seen it in years.
And we filled a lot of the hole, the expected hole, with last year's CARES Act funding and moving funding around related to that. So it's an ongoing story of federal support propping up what ordinarily would have been big cuts to the state budget. So we'll see if that's able to continue. But they just re-estimated things, and just like last time, they couldn't take into consideration the expected windfall from the federal government. So the governor's budget and the budget offices in the House and Senate both are operating under the sort of premise that we won't pass the bill, even though that they know that it is likely to come down the line.
At least some form of the bill. I don't think that the current form of the bill will get through the Senate without some adjustments, but it's very possible that a very substantial stimulus will be forthcoming soon.
And yeah, surprising. I was just going to say, surprisingly, there's little debate on the top line number in the U.S. Senate. There's debate about all the provisions that go along with the bill, but the funding for the state and local governments seems to be surprisingly secure.
And as you noted, Matt, this particular bill does include money for local governments. And as a matter of fact, the governor in her proposed budget included supplementary funding to cities in Michigan that levy an income tax because of the issues revolving around people who are now working from home, and obviously not in that particular city. So I'm sure that people in local government are looking at this stimulus with a bit of a sigh of a relief, but at some point, all of this will end, right?
Well, they are sighing some relief, but especially in the schools, they're also still fighting over the details. So all of the state school associations are objecting to the current formula at the federal level for allocating education funding, which is heavily dependent on Title I funding. And another way of saying that is that the rich school districts don't like that most of the money is going to the poorer school districts in the stimulus funding. So they're still going to have debates about that. But the local government funding is even more needed. That's in the federal stimulus bill, which is less than state government, but still substantial, still more than $100 billion. There's actually more evidence that that's needed than the state funding. Local revenue is way down.
In Michigan, more than in most states, the local governments have only limited ability to raise revenues. And there was a time, a long time ago, when it looked like the state was going to fill in the gap with revenue sharing, but the state has really reneged on its commitments to the local governments again and again, and that has left many local governments with very difficult decisions about, we don't have enough money to fix the broken sidewalks. We'd like to have another police officer, but we can't afford it, and on and on.
This also won't be our last bite at the apple necessarily. Biden is expected to focus heavily on an infrastructure package as the next major bill, with also an opportunity to use the reconciliation process again, so to not need more than 50 votes in the U.S. Senate. And of course, we had a governor who wanted a lot of state money spent on infrastructure, road infrastructure, and only got sort of part of the way there. So it'll be interesting to see if we also have an opportunity to get some federal transportation funding as well.
Charley, what any thoughts on the changes in the economy? I mean, even with all of this federal help that's been coming in to states such as Michigan, the economy itself, the world of work, the income inequality gap, these are still issues that are going to have to be addressed long term.
These are very important issues. In fact, it's a judgment call, but in my judgment, the phenomenal increase in inequality and income and wealth in the last 40 years it's arguably the biggest economic issue of our time. And we won't get the official census report for 2020 until about 6 months from now in September. But I predict, based on what we've seen with the job losses, that were disproportionately large for low-wage workers, for women, for minorities. I think that we will see a noticeable increase in the poverty rate and a noticeable increase in the degree of income inequality in 2020, and that's likely to extend to 2021 at least. That's a concern, because especially for a lot of these low-wage workers, many men, there's this recent book by the Nobel Prize winner Angus Deaton and his wife Ann Case called Deaths of Despair, about how in less educated, especially less educated whites, but increasingly less educated African Americans as well, there's been an unprecedented increase in death rates due to alcohol, opioid overdoses, and suicides. And so the long-term trends, which have been very unfavorable toward the less skilled, the low-wage workers, I think we got to turn more attention to those than we have. Whether we'll have the political will to do that in a serious way, I guess that remains to be seen.
Well, and that, of course, leads us back to the Michigan budget debate, and Republicans holding up money, not necessarily based on where it's going to go, but based on the broader policies of the Governor Whitmer administration in terms of opening up the economy. So as we start to see those kinds of numbers, it will only add fuel to the fire of opening up the economy and making sure people have an opportunity to get back to work. And maybe with that is a good time to introduce Dr. Chandra and to talk about some of the work that he has been doing in looking at reemerging from pandemic and comparing and looking at the pandemic of 1918, which of course we know went for a couple of years, which is probably what's happening here as well. So Dr. Chandra, tell us a little bit about your work.
The main theme of the most recent paper that we published on the 1918 influenza pandemic is that the pandemic actually probably took 2 years to unfold in Michigan. And it consisted of 4 waves of what epidemiologists call excess mortality. The first wave occurred in March of 1918. It was a relatively mild wave, and everybody thought by about April that we were done with it. Unfortunately, it revisited us, the influenza, in October 1918 with a massive wave of excess mortality that was brought under control very briefly. But then we had another wave in December and January of 1918 and 1919. And then when that subsided and everybody thought they were finally done with the pandemic, the largest wave of all visited Michigan in February 1920. So that's really the main message of the research is pandemics like the 1918 influenza pandemic can actually take a long time to work their way through populations.
And of course, this was during a time when we did not have vaccines. So was a large part of the public health safety around social gathering, limiting social gatherings and maskings, and how did that all play a role?
Well, probably the most well-known move that was made by our legislature, actually not by our legislature, by the governor. So the governor at the time was Albert Sleeper, and he imposed a ban on public gatherings in October, in the 3rd week of October, 1918, in response to that massive second wave that was visiting Michigan. And when we look at cases and deaths from influenza during the weeks of 1918, October and November 1918, we see that the measures actually brought the wave under control. So the number of cases fell quite rapidly, and so did the number of deaths. Unfortunately, 3 weeks after he imposed the ban on public gatherings, partly due to pressure from the business community and economic interests, he relaxed the ban. And unfortunately, that coincided with the Thanksgiving and then the Christmas holiday when a lot of people get together. And so we had yet another wave. There are some very interesting parallels between what happened in 1918 and what we're seeing in Michigan today. For example, the 3-week social distancing orders that the governor put into place a few weeks ago.
Yeah, you're right. It's very similar patterns with or without a vaccine, not just to note here in Michigan, but certainly even around the world. And what do you see as the implications? We were just talking about economic pressures that are underlying the economy moving out of the pandemic. And so how do you see the economy moving forward in this kind of an up and down? I mean, I was reading the other day where folks, it's going to be summertime soon, and many people are being afforded an opportunity to get the shot, and our drug companies are saying that they're going to be producing even more of the vaccine. And what do you see in terms of the pent-up social demand, I think, of individuals, across the country and across the world as the summertime is almost upon us, having an impact?
So I'll preface what I'm going to say by going back to what Charley said a little bit earlier. What he said is there probably already has been a bifurcation between haves and have-nots during the pandemic. But for those, and it is the majority of the working population who have managed to continue to work because the kind of work that they do has not been heavily disrupted by the pandemic. For them, we're going to see, there's a lot of pent-up demand. And I think as soon as the vaccines start reaching large segments of the population and the economy opens up, we're going to see, I think, a spike in demand for travel and recreation-related sectors of the economy. We were discussing the other day that, things like exercise equipment for the home, orders for those kinds of goods have already spiked as people reallocate their income away from, what they would do under normal times, under normal circumstances, into these more sort of COVID-friendly, if you will, activities. So I do see, in addition to the stimulus that's coming our way from the federal government, I think there's going to be a little added shot of stimulus in the form of consumer expenditure in the coming months as people, as the economy opens up and people start getting out.
So what do you take as the lessons for today? I mean, one reading might be, we've never been able to keep it on lockdown or changed our activities for a long period, and we're sort of destined to see these spikes later on. Another might be that that we should take a more long-term approach. How do you see it?
From the health standpoint, so let me put a hypothetical situation on the table, right? What if we were able to, and this is completely unrealistic right now, given the state of technology, but what if we were able to more rapidly develop vaccines, right? And test them and roll them out? What would that do? I think that is an area that, we should really look into. We've, through the National Institutes of Health and other types of, health research organizations, we've made phenomenal advances in medicine over the past 100 years. And I think looking into whether there are ways in which vaccines can be developed and rolled out more rapidly, and maybe there are and maybe there aren't, I think that is a very interesting direction in which we should think about going.
Certainly, these vaccines were developed in record speed, and that's the very good news. Not so good news that the beginning of the rollout of the vaccine was very bumpy. From the middle of December to well into January, there were lots of glitches in the system, lots of organizational problems. But it certainly appears that pace of vaccination has picked up a lot, and that's I'll give you a personal anecdote. I got my second Pfizer dose yesterday, so I'm well on the way to being pretty well protected from this thing. And echoing what was just said, I think I'm going to be traveling more in the coming months than I was able to for the last year.
May I add to that, Charlie, another response to Matt's question, and that is, the importance of history, right? We were taught a lesson in 1918. We had this pandemic. It was a viral pandemic. There was no cure for it. And in fact, at that time, there was not even a hope for a vaccine. We could have learned from it. We could have put measures into place based on what happened then to prevent a number of things that have happened to us this time around from happening. Unfortunately, and some very well-known epidemiologists have called the 1918 influenza pandemic the forgotten pandemic. Unfortunately, we forgot about the pandemic, right? Pandemics are going to keep coming. There are going to be new viruses in the future. Some of them are going to be respiratory in nature. They're going to cause the kinds of problems that the 1918 influenza pandemic caused, that the COVID-19 pandemic is causing. We're going to see these come again. Let's not forget this time.
And so what might some of those have been or could be, Dr. Chandra?
Well, so I'm actually going back to the point that Charlie made about vaccine rollout, right? What went wrong there? Why has the US lost 500,000 lives? What are the kinds of things we are doing that we shouldn't be doing? I personally think, and some of this is cultural, right? I think that the emphasis on personal liberty and freedom is very important, right? And it's something we really cherish and value in our society. But I think there are times when we need to be cognizant that individual actions have consequences for other people that can be far more detrimental to them than they might be to ourselves. And we really do need, in times of crisis like this, to be a lot more considerate for other people than I think a lot of people have been.
And that's certainly my concern, I think, with the summer months coming up here. We might be able to speed up the vaccination process. And it's possible that, I mean, I'm hopeful that President Biden is correct, that at some point this summer we'll have had vaccinated nearly the entire population. I'm hopeful. I can't say that I'm confident, but I am hopeful. And as these summer months and warmer weather comes, whether people are vaccinated or not, whether they choose to get the vaccine or not, things are going to open up one way or the other. Governor Whitmer the other day noted that there are some less restrictions on the way. I just think at this point in time, human nature is going to play a much larger role, whether you want to call it cultural in terms of freedoms and liberties, or just human nature. You know, a lot of us have been working from home for a year now. As you noted, some of us have had to continue to work even during the pandemic. So I'll be very, very interested to see what happens during these upcoming spring and summer months. Then as we get back into the fall, are we going to have another spike? Keep reading it almost every day about new mutations. There was one in the paper yesterday, in the news yesterday, about one specific to New York that might actually itself be be so-called immune to the vaccine. So I'm going to be very interested to see what happens. I know that I'm going to continue personally to be wary and hope at some point in time this spring or summer I'm able to get the shot myself.
If I may follow up, Arnold, on what you said, the jury is still out on whether that 1920 wave of excess deaths was caused by the same pathogen or the same virus that caused the 1918 deaths, right? Was it a totally different virus? Was it a mutated version of the 1918 virus? Or was it the same virus? So the point you make is a very important one. We don't know what's coming. There's a possibility that the virus may mutate and cause another wave of excess mortality because it has defenses against the vaccines that we're rolling out. Definitely an important point and another possible lesson from the 1918 pandemic.
We've had in our lifetime HIV, HIV/AIDS, which has killed tens of millions worldwide, especially in parts of Africa, although it did it more slowly. And then we've had SARS, MERS, Zika, Ebola. So it shouldn't come as a big surprise that we have had this contagion. The one thing that made this one worse was that the COVID-19 is a combination of asymptomatic transmission and virulence that has made it hard to tamp down. Dr. Chandra, how would you compare this virus with the one of a century ago? Is it similar in the degree of virulence? Is it worse or not as bad?
So there again, the science is not sort of very precise, right? You get different estimates of virulence depending on the population that the virus is circulating in, climatic conditions, nutritional, genetic, all kinds of other factors. But I think generally speaking, it seems to have a lot of the features in terms of, what we call reproduction number. So the number of cases that will be caused by one case, right, in a population that has been hitherto unexposed to the virus. So it has a lot of the features of the 1918 virus. I did want to add, Charlie, to what you said earlier, that in addition to all those other pandemics that you talked about, we actually had an influenza pandemic as recently as 2009, and that was caused by an H1N1 virus, which was a descendant of the virus that caused the 1918 influenza, right? So there are pandemics, it could very well be that this corona virus, this version of it, has descendants in the future that emerge that cause pandemics as well.
Well, very interesting work, Dr. Chandra. I think, always looking at history gives us a clue to the future. You note, I think with some precision, that we're going to see additional pandemics. Charlie, you noted others that have been upon us, and Ebola has again reared its ugly head in Western Africa. And if those of us that have never experienced an Ebola outbreak, which most of the world has not, far, far worse virus and disease than what we're experiencing now. So I think, Dr. Chandra, you're absolutely right. We have to take this moment in time and prepare ourselves for future outbreaks. Any other thoughts you'd like to leave us with?
I think the message of the importance of history is probably the most important. We will have pandemics like this in the future, and whatever we can learn from COVID-19 and influenza 1918, we should pick up. I would like to make a pitch for more research on vaccine development. It seems like if there is a silver bullet in all of this, it is the development of vaccines. There may be things that we aren't yet thinking about that could potentially speed up those processes. If we can invest in finding out how we might be able to do that, I think that could yield a lot of benefit, both in terms of health and in terms of the economy in the future.
Well, thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Chandra, and for your work. Matt and Charlie, any final thoughts?
Well, I'll just echo in maybe a more controversial way a few things that we've been saying, which is that we do have some good news. We are making progress. The vaccine story is amazing. And some of it came from, some institutions that we normally have some skepticism about. Big government has been very useful. Big corporations, including research entities and pharmaceutical companies, and big science and universities and research, all funded with tax dollars, have been extremely influential in helping to solve not only this crisis, but the others that Charlie mentioned.
And at least in the next couple of months, it's still important, even though we're making very rapid progress with vaccination, still really important for people to wear their mask, practice social distancing. We're not out of the woods yet.
Well, thank you, Charlie and Matt, as always, and Dr. Chandra. That's all the time we have on this edition of State of the State. My thanks again to Russ White and the folks at WKAR for the support of this program. Join us again next month on State of the State.